When Kathy Kleiner Rubin was 13 years old, her biggest threat wasn't a man lurking in the dark. It was her own body. Kathy was diagnosed with lupus. It was serious enough that normal teenage life was replaced by doctors, hospitals, medications, and long stretches of isolation. While other teenagers were going to school and hanging out with their friends, Kathy was forced to adapt to illness, isolation, and uncertainty. She learned what it felt like to listen to adults discuss whether she would survive while sitting in the same room. And then she learned something else: recovery. Kathy survived. Over the next several years, she grew stronger, eventually leaving home for college. After an adolescence spent isolated, she had finally gained something precious: normalcy. And by January of 1978, 20-year-old Kathy was attending Florida State University, living life as a regular college student. She had friends, classes, a social life. She was a member of the Chi Omega sorority, where she shared a room with her sorority sister, Karen Chandler. And in the early morning hours of January 15th, Kathy was asleep in that very bedroom when the door opened and Ted Bundy stepped inside. This is usually where Kathy Kleiner Rubin's story begins. And that's the problem. Ted Bundy never began Kathy's survival story. He entered a story that had already been unfolding for years. This week, we aren't just talking about the night that Kathy survived one of America's most infamous serial killers. We're talking about the woman who learned how to fight for her life long before he ever walked through her door, and what it meant to keep surviving long after he was gone. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught. To understand Kathy Kleiner Rubin's story, we have to resist skipping ahead to 1978. By the time Ted Bundy entered her bedroom at Florida State University, Kathy already had an entire history with fear, pain, uncertainty, and survival. Kathy was born in Miami, Florida, to a very loving Cuban American family. Her childhood was initially ordinary, the usual expectations of growing up and living a full life. But when she was young, her father died. And before she could even settle into life after the loss, at about 13, she became seriously ill. The diagnosis was lupus. Lupus is an autoimmune disease where the immune system becomes confused and it attacks the body's healthy tissue instead of viruses and bacteria. And diagnoses in the 1970s, when treatment options were very limited and the illness was less understood, that made Kathy's case severe, and it meant spending very long stretches of her adolescence in hospitals, on different medications, and generally separated from other children. At an age when most young people start building their own worlds with their own friends, Kathy's world shrank down to doctors, medication, family, and a terrifying uncertainty of what her body would do next. When we talk about child illness survivors, it's easy to rush through the experience because we already know the ending. The child lived. But a 13-year-old living through it doesn't get to look ahead to being 20 years old. She doesn't know she's going to attend college or join a sorority or get married or work or write a book or even grow older. She only knows that her normal life has stopped. The adults around her are terrified and her body isn't behaving. For most kids, normal is the default assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like it did today. When you're ill, seriously so, normal becomes something you just watch other people have. School and social life are things that other kids get to do, and privacy fades under constant medical scrutiny. Kathy developed a very strange relationship with her body. It was simultaneously the thing that was threatening her, but also it was keeping her alive, and she couldn't walk away from what was scaring her. She had to exist inside of it, enduring treatments, waiting, and very slowly recovering. And we shouldn't turn Kathy's lupus into one of those inspirational training montages for what would happen later. She didn't get sick to prepare for Ted Bundy. There's nothing good about a 13-year-old suffering. Suffering is not a gift just because somebody survived it. Yet, experiences do teach us lessons regardless. And long before Kathy encountered Bundy, she knew what it was like to feel physically vulnerable. And she knew that that fear could last longer than just a couple of minutes. She learned that recovery wasn't dramatic like television, it was often slow, boring, and incremental. And she also learned that being helpless in one moment doesn't mean that you remain helpless forever. Crucially, she had concrete evidence that her body could endure something terrifying. Her body had frightened her before. Treatments had hurt before. And she had made it through day after day. Eventually, Kathy's health improved enough for the world to open back up for her. And for a teenager who'd spent so much of her time isolated, that didn't mean just getting better, it meant getting her life back. When Kathy left Miami for Florida State University, she wasn't preparing for a future encounter with something evil. After years of her body dictating what she could do, she finally had the chance to decide what she could do next, what she wanted. And it was wonderfully, beautifully ordinary. Kathy chose Florida State University in Tallahassee because of its normalcy. I mean, this looked like a typical ordinary step for a young woman from Florida. You graduate, you pack up, and you leave home. But for Kathy, moving hundreds of miles away from her family and doctors meant a lot more to her. She was finally on her own. Independence means something different when you've been very seriously ill. Most teenagers fight for independence by default, and they demand space and privacy while resisting adult supervision. But serious illness delays that transition. People have to hover when you're sick. Schedules revolve around medical tests and medications and physical limitations rather than personal choices. So at college, Kathy finally gained autonomy. She could decide wherever she wanted to go, who she was going to spend time with, what she was going to do. She could worry about classes instead of medical tests. She could stay up late. She could go on dates. She could experience non-life or death college problems that felt huge for 3 days before they disappeared. And she also joined Chi Omega, contrasting her years of medical isolation to now living in a house overflowing with women, borrowing clothes, getting ready together, making plans, navigating communal living. At Chi Omega, she wasn't the girl with lupus. She was just Kathy, a student, a fellow sister, a roommate, and a friend figuring out her adulthood. It's very easy to view the Chi Omega house strictly as the crime scene because, well, we know what happened there. But to Kathy and her sisters, before January 15th, 1978, it was home, independence, and it was friendship. For Kathy, it was proof that the years of hospitals and isolation hadn't lasted forever and that her world had expanded 50 miles away from Miami to Tallahassee. She had gotten out, gotten better, and gotten to grow up. There's a distinct cruelty to what happened to her next. Because Bundy didn't attack Kathy in a high risk scenario, she was asleep in her own bed instead of a house full of her friends. The very place that represented her reclaimed independence was about to become a place where someone would try and take control of her body all over again. Before going into that bedroom, however, we have to look at the man who entered the house. The Ted Bundy who arrived in Tallahassee in January of 1978 was not the calculated figure of earlier years. The mask wasn't just slipping. There was barely a mask left at all. When we discussed Rhonda Stapley last week, we looked at a version of Ted Bundy who relied heavily on performance. He was the one approaching women, appearing ordinary or even vulnerable. He created a situation where a woman was willing to move closer to him. And that version depended on control, charm, time, getting a woman to make a choice that put her within reach so that he could isolate her. That is not the Ted who arrived in Tallahassee in January of 1978. By this point, Ted Bundy had escaped custody twice. First in June of 1977 when he jumped from a courthouse window in Aspen, Colorado, fleeing into the mountains before being recaptured. Then in December, he'd escaped the Garfield County Jail by essentially starving himself to be so thin that he could climb through a hole in his ceiling, stealing a guard uniform and exiting the building. That second escape changed everything. Bundy was no longer a killer maintaining the appearance of an ordinary life while moving between cities. He was an actively hunted fugitive, living under false names, stealing, surviving day to day, moving across the country. He reached Tallahassee, Florida, calling himself Chris Hagen. His behavior here requires close examination. Compared to earlier attacks, the contrast at Chi Omega is striking. No elaborate approach, conversation, fake injury, asking for help, or attempting to appear harmless. There was no social manipulation to get a woman to go somewhere. He broke the door lock ahead of time and entered the home while everyone was sleeping. That alone signifies a different kind of crime. And true crime coverage often attempts to narrate behavioral changes as if we can read the killer's mind. But we can't really know Bundy's thoughts with any certainty. We can only evaluate the patterns, circumstances, and changes. And what we do know is that his circumstances had changed dramatically. He lacked that stable public identity, long term access to his victims, and all of the freedom he had once possessed on the West Coast. Was Bundy becoming less controlled or more impulsive? Possibly, but his fugitive status also altered the opportunities that were available to him. Earlier in his crimes, Bundy engineered situations. At Chi Omega, he simply seized one. And that distinction matters because entering an occupied sorority house in the middle of the night carries extraordinary risk. It's not an isolated victim on a dark road. It's a building full of people where anyone could wake up, come home, hear something, turn on the lights, call the police. Yet Bundy went inside anyway. This indicates either a willingness to accept far more risk or a reduced ability to plan, or maybe both. It also reflects desperation. By January of 1978, his life was collapsing, and he was running rather than maintaining a respectable facade. Popular mythology freezes Bundy as the handsome law student, showing the pictures of him defending himself at trial, the charming stranger, the man with the arm sling, the master manipulator. But criminal methods and risk tolerances do evolve. And by the time Bundy reached Florida, that very neat image was unsustainable. At Chi Omega, Kathy didn't need to trust him. She didn't choose to be near him. She didn't hear a story or accept a ride or decide that he seemed safe. She was asleep. This dismantles that persistent myth around Bundy that his victims all fell for him or they made poor decisions. At Chi Omega, there was no decision to make. Bundy violated the boundary of their home. And the violence didn't stop there. After he left the sorority house, he attacked Cheryl Thomas nearby in her apartment, and less than a month later, he would abduct 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City, Florida, and Kimberly was his final known murder victim before he was captured days later. When Bundy walked into Chi Omega, we aren't watching the beginning of the mythology. We're watching it all unravel. A fugitive running out of places to hide and taking bigger and bigger risks walked into a house full of sleeping women, and one of them was Kathy Kleiner. Now, January 14th, 1978 was a typical Saturday night in Florida State University. People went out, people came at different times, talked, they went to bed, and the Chi Omega house settled down gradually. Kathy Kleiner and her roommate, Karen Chandler, went to sleep. Most accounts of the Chi Omega murders quickly turned into a timeline of Bundy's movements. He entered here, he went upstairs, he attacked these people. But there were other women on the other ends of those sentences, and before reaching Kathy's bedroom, I want to say their names. Margaret Peggy Bowman was 21 years old. She was a senior from Maryland, and she was studying fashion and art. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend, and she was a sorority sister who people knew her laugh, and they expected to see her again. Peggy was not just a victim. Lisa Levy was 20 years old. She was from St. Petersburg, Florida. She was studying fashion and merchandising. She also had a family, friends, plans, and a life that was meant to stretch far beyond the room where Bundy found her. I want to give Peggy and Lisa this space because of what happened afterward narratively. Their names are permanently attached to Bundy's. Their sorority house photos became crime scene images. Their bedrooms became evidence. And before he walked into those rooms, he was an absolute stranger. There were no alarms, no dramatic confrontation. Peggy Bowman was asleep in her bedroom when he entered and attacked her. He went to Lisa Levy's room, where she was also asleep, and he killed her. what matters most here is the speed and vulnerability of it. These two women were killed inside of their home within minutes of him entering the house, and it was still full of people. And instead of leaving, Bundy stayed. He accepted the massive risk with every extra second, sound, and open door, and he moved through the house again. Kathy Kleiner was asleep, unaware that Peggy and Lisa were dead, that a wanted fugitive was inside of their home, or that she was in any real danger. We often emphasize situational awareness in true crime, watching your surroundings, trusting your instincts, having an escape plan, which is very useful, but safety isn't magic. Sometimes there's no warning. And outside, Chayomeka's sister Nita Neary was returning home, eventually spotting a man leaving and becoming a critical witness. But inside of the dark bedroom, Kathy and Karen were asleep, and Bundy was walking down the hall. He reached the room and he stepped inside. The first thing that Kathy remembers is the sound, not any screaming or footprints or the door opening, but there was a footlocker near the entrance that Bundy bumped into as he entered their room. And it woke Kathy from a deep sleep. She remembers looking through the doorway and seeing a male silhouette with a raised arm holding something, which we now know was a piece of wood. And before her brain could process what was happening or register any fear, the weapon came down. Kathy describes that first impact not as immediate pain, as tremendous pressure, a heavy thud against her face. And in moments of sudden trauma, stress hormones surge and the nervous system delays pain, processing to prioritize your immediate survival first. Survival in violence is rarely neat. That fight or flight thing doesn't always kick in. Kathy was processing fragmented information. Dark room, figure, raised arm, impact, pressure. What's happening to me? Bundy's strike shattered Kathy's jaw in multiple places. His attention then turned to her roommate, Karen, who he also began to attack in her bed. Despite the catastrophic injuries, Kathy was conscious. And realizing she was still alive, Bundy turned back toward her and he raised the weapon again. Kathy couldn't overpower him, outrun him, or do any sort of self-defense. Her survival came down to chance. Outside of the building, another Chayomeka sister pulled into the driveway, and her car's headlights swept across the building, suddenly flooding Kathy and Karen's bedroom with light. Ted Bundy had taken massive risks by even entering this house. Light meant potential discovery. Someone was there, someone could walk in, so he ran away. And that interruption saved Kathy Kleiner's life. While survivor stories will often focus on heroic actions, this was luck. But what wasn't luck was the fact that Kathy had survived years of illness and had endurance and understood treatment. Survival was something outside of her control, but what would happen afterward, she knew how to handle. A lot of times when we discuss this story, they don't really talk about the immediate aftermath. Because while Bundy was gone, Kathy was still in very serious, real danger. Her body was the emergency. Her jaw was completely shattered. Her face was severely injured. Kathy tried to scream to alert the other house guests, and in her head, the command was clear: make noise, be heard, but she couldn't scream. There was so much damage to her face that only a gurgling sound came out. Completely unable to project her voice, Kathy didn't know if Bundy was gone. She didn't know if he would come back and finish the job. She didn't know what had happened to her roommate right next to her, let alone the other two roommates down the hall. In moments of extreme physical trauma, survival responses transcend standard categories. The body's priority becomes strictly mechanical. Maintain consciousness, breathe, get air, attract attention. Shock usually causes profound stillness or detachment as the brain tries to manage overwhelming pain and sensory inputs. Help soon arrived as police and paramedics filled the Chayomeka house. Hallways once associated with college life now were crime scenes, with officers and medical personnel moving through the building. The sorority sisters who were coming home from having been out that night were left trying to figure out who was alive, who was hurt, what happened here. Kathy was rushed into emergency medical care. She required immediate surgery. Her jaw had to be wired shut. It initiated a very lengthy recovery process. And this is where Kathy's story almost folds back on itself. After fighting for years to leave behind the world of illness, she was right back in the medical system. Once again, her life being dictated by treatments, doctors, physical limitations, all interrupting her independence. However, there was one vital difference. Kathy wasn't 13 anymore. And during her adolescent battle with lupus, she had no idea that normal life would come back to her. This time, she had already lived through that slow space between catastrophe and recovery. She knew that being in this hospital was only temporary, that needing help wasn't permanent, and her life would expand again. This is where Kathy's childhood becomes important again. Not because her lupus prepared her for Ted Bundy. I definitely want to be careful with that language because the cliche constantly attached to suffering is everything happens for a reason, which is a phrase that I personally hate. When my mom died, people said versions of it to me and it made me enraged. Sometimes something horrible happens and there's absolutely no satisfying reason, no lesson big enough to justify it, and no future event that suddenly makes this experience worth it. Sometimes something is just awful. Kathy didn't develop lupus at 13 because the universe knew that Ted Bundy was going to walk in her room 7 years later. Her childhood illness wasn't a training program, and she definitely didn't need to suffer to earn the ability to survive as an adult. Claiming that diminishes what Kathy did because human resilience is way more complex and honestly more interesting than destiny. We accumulate experiences. Every terrible, wonderful, frightening, ordinary thing we live through becomes part of the information that we carry forward. Sometimes coping mechanisms developed for one situation prove really useful somewhere entirely unexpected. Kathy had learned how to be a patient, a skill nobody really wants to develop. Hospitals have their own rhythms. Strangers need to access your body at all hours of the day and night. People wake you up while you're sleeping. You're repeatedly asked the same questions over and over again. You're told to wait, told something won't hurt, only it actually does. Your schedule and your body are no longer your own, and progress is so slow. Kathy already knew that world, and she understood something difficult to accept after a catastrophic injury. The body you have today isn't necessarily the body you're going to have 6 months from now. Immediately after the attack, Kathy couldn't know how much function she would ever regain. Fast forward through surgery or skip to when eating, speaking, and existing became easier. She had to live through that painful middle where the inspirational language about strength seems to fall apart. We just love a story where a survivor says, I decided this wasn't going to beat me, before the cinematic music swells and they walk out of the hospital. Some of you guys know that I just spent the last 10 months relearning how to walk, and honestly, I'm still struggling. Sometimes the only strength you have while recovering is letting somebody help you to the bathroom, letting you drink some liquid meals, or allowing a doctor to perform another procedure when you want everybody to stop touching you. Sometimes it's crying, it's being angry, or being a terrible patient one afternoon because you're exhausted and overwhelmed, and then you wake up the next morning and you have to do it again. That's resilience. With temporary physical limitations comes a psychological adjustment. When something you could do yesterday becomes impossible today, the brain often translates, I can't do this right now, into I can't do this anymore. Those aren't the same thing. Kathy had learned that distinction at 13 when illness shrank her world. After Bundy, Kathy possessed something enormously valuable that she had lacked her first time. Evidence. Not the evidence that everything would be fine, but evidence that a terrible present doesn't dictate your future. She also understood another uncomfortable truth. Accepting help doesn't make you any less independent. That realization is especially difficult when you've just fought your way into adulthood. She spent years getting healthy enough to leave home and live on her own terms, only for one more person to make her physically dependent on caregivers again in just a few minutes. Needing help while healing isn't the same as losing yourself, though. Temporary helplessness isn't permanent helplessness. And none of this means that Kathy sailed through her recovery. Being strong doesn't mean you're immune to suffering. people can still be very resilient while also being terrified, furious, and exhausted. You can hate absolutely every second of what it is you're going through and still survive it. Kathy had survived an unwanted, unchosen hardship without being grateful for the experience. Now she was being asked to do it again under completely different circumstances and with very different injuries. But it was still a familiar process: treatment, waiting, healing, setbacks, and eventually doing the things that were impossible yesterday. Ted Bundy catastrophically injured Kathy's body and he interrupted her life. But she knew something fundamental about interruptions: they end. Once again, she would have to discover what her body could do after surviving something that never should have happened to her. So far, I've deliberately stayed very close to Kathy, but I want to pull the camera back because Kathy wasn't the only woman who survived that night at Chi Omega. Karen Chandler was still in the bedroom, also catastrophically injured, right next to Kathy Kleiner. Bundy hit her repeatedly, leaving her with severe head and facial injuries. Like Kathy, she survived, but surviving didn't mean that she walked away unharmed. And Bundy still wasn't finished that night. After he left Chi Omega, he traveled a couple blocks away to another residence where Florida State student Cheryl Thomas was sleeping. Cheryl's injuries were devastating. They included serious head and facial fractures and permanent hearing damage. Yet Cheryl survived. By sunrise on January 15th, 2 women were dead: Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and 3 women were alive: Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. That distinction is important because traditional serial killer stories create a strange problem with the word victim. We tend to divide women into 2 categories: the killer murdered and the ones who got away. But what about the ones who didn't get away? What about somebody like Kathy, Karen, or Cheryl, who survived, but they were maimed? They didn't escape in the way that Rhonda Stapley did. There was no moment they could physically break or run away. They survived him, and survival is just very messy. You're still here, but now you face surgeries, rehabilitation, scars, pain, trauma, medical bills, terrified family members, a bedroom that no longer feels safe, and a life now solidly divided into before and after. Karen, Kathy, and Cheryl also complicate Bundy's mythology of competence. That intelligent, meticulous predator and charming manipulator who supposedly knew exactly what he was always doing. On January 15th, he just attacked 5 women in a very short period of time. 3 of them didn't die, and it didn't seem to make any sense or match any of his prior methodology. And listen, pointing this out doesn't minimize the crimes, but it does remind us that serial killers are not supernatural beings with the perfect ability to control life and death. Bundy could inflict horrific violence and intend for someone to die, and he still failed. Kathy lived. Karen lived. Cheryl lived. Their survival matters beyond their ability to testify or provide information. They got entire lives afterward, the part serial killer narratives often forget. We spend so much time counting bodies that survival almost becomes a footnote. But survivors aren't unsuccessful murder victims. They are people whose stories continued. And if we're going to tell the story of what Bundy did in Tallahassee, the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy are all part of the story. But so are Kathy Kleiner, Carol Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. He doesn't get to be the only person we remember from that night. Now, a year and a half later in 1979, Kathy Kleiner saw Ted Bundy again. But this time it was when he was on trial in Miami for the Chi Omega murders and attacks, and Kathy was called to testify. Consider the contrast between these 2 encounters. On January 15th, she's asleep in bed. Bundy controls the time, the place, the conditions. She has no warning, no information, and no choice in the matter. He was standing there armed, and she was vulnerable. The encounter was entirely structured around stripping away her control. But in 1979, it's all flipped. Kathy walks into that courtroom by choice, knowing exactly where Bundy is and why he's there. He is no longer wandering freely. He's the defendant in custody, surrounded by officers, lawyers, a judge, jury, and very strict rules. For once, Ted Bundy was the confined person, and Kathy had the floor. And the courtroom testimony matters far beyond establishing evidence. While courtrooms can be frightening or even re traumatizing, testifying can allow a survivor the opportunity to describe an experience where the control was stripped away and reclaim it in their own terms. Kathy describes staring Bundy down in that courtroom, and she said she felt a shift of power. That doesn't mean she wasn't afraid. That agency doesn't erase fear, and recovery isn't the magic absence of trauma. But agency is having a choice again. Kathy looked at him and she spoke because she decided to. And Bundy had to sit there and listen. He couldn't disappear into the darkness. He couldn't raise a weapon or control anything about that day. Throughout his life, Bundy manipulated narratives. He lied. He used aliases. He attempted to control how the public understood his crimes. But Kathy's testimony wasn't something he could control. The woman he attacked, while unconscious in a dark room, was sitting under courtroom lights, looking directly at him. And her testimony didn't rebuild her jaw or erase her trauma or undo Karen or Cheryl's injuries or bring back Peggy Bowman or Lisa Levy, but it restored what Bundy had stolen from her in the first encounter: choice. The first time Ted Bundy saw Kathy Kleiner, he decided everything. The second time, Kathy decided, because she was the one who had survived. Looking across that courtroom, Ted Bundy had absolutely no power left to silence her. The subtitle of Kathy's memoir, A Light in the Dark, includes 5 words that completely reframe her narrative: surviving more than Ted Bundy. In a traditional true crime account, Kathy's story ends shortly after Bundy's conviction. Maybe it extends a little further to the execution, but real lives don't follow criminal crime cases. Kathy didn't stop existing when the trial ended. She went home, went to work, built relationships, lived her life. And because her life continued, so did new challenges. While she was working at a bank, Kathy faced sudden violence again during a bank robbery. Trauma fundamentally alters your understanding of probability. And while most people view a terrible event as unlikely possibilities, Kathy already knew firsthand that statistically improbable horror happens. And she survived that too. Years later, she faced another fight: breast cancer. Once again, she went through treatment and she survived. Calling Kathy a superhero for surviving lupus, Ted Bundy, a bank robbery, and cancer really oversimplifies her reality. Suffering isn't a competition, and surviving one ordeal doesn't give you immunity from the next. There's really no finish line to survival. We kind of treat survivors like they're a completed past tense label, but survival is really an ongoing process. You can rebuild after trauma and still get sick, experience loss, and face entirely new hardships. But that doesn't mean you failed at your recovery. That's why Surviving More Than Ted Bundy is a crucial step title. But Bundy was not her life's organizing principle. He was one horrific person who invaded her space for a couple minutes of her life. Her survival story encompasses that ill 13-year-old girl learning patience, the 20-year-old who woke up to violence, the woman who stared down an attacker in court, an armed robbery survivor, a cancer survivor, and the thousands of ordinary days in between all of those events. Kathy didn't survive Ted Bundy to reach the end of her story. She survived so she could keep having one. This perspective reveals why she chose that title. A purely commercial choice would have been, I survived Ted Bundy, place his name right in front, let's collect those dollars. But she chose A Light in the Dark to be the title, and then Surviving More Than Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy's name is there because his actions did permanently affect her, but his name isn't the title. Her light is. We have a tendency to freeze survivors in time, reducing their full human life to a simple label, like Ted Bundy survivor. Perpetrators are given extensive coverage, their childhood, psychology, methods, motives, all endlessly analyzed. But the people that they attack are flattened into the girl who survived, or an entry on a victim list. Survival ends up defined by the perpetrator. Kathy's memoir rejects that framing by putting Bundy back into proper context. He is part of the story, but he is not its author. While pop culture will fixate on Bundy's name, escapes, trial footage, few people know what Kathy did with the next 48 years of her life. Surviving isn't about becoming an inspirational figure or finding silver linings. Sometimes you just have to continue to exist. Kathy recovered, testified, worked, loved, faced new fears, got sick, healed, and grew older. Ted Bundy gets one chapter. Kathy gets the whole book. The darkness might draw attention, but it doesn't get to define the whole story. And I want to end this where we started, with a 13-year-old Kathy Kleiner, a young girl dealing with lupus, separated from her ordinary life, surrounded by medical uncertainty. That Kathy couldn't see 20-year-old Kathy, healthy, leaving Miami for Florida State, joining Chi Omega, building the wonderfully ordinary life she'd always wanted. And 20-year-old Kathy couldn't see what was coming in the morning of January 15th. She couldn't know she was going to wake to her footlocker being knocked over, or see that man in her doorway and get thrust back into hospital surgeries and recovery. Nor could Kathy, lying injured in that bedroom, see the woman who would follow, the woman who would recover, stare down her attacker in court, survive another violent crime, beat cancer, write a book, and tell her story in her own words. All of those women are Kathy. Ted Bundy occupied mere minutes in Kathy Kleiner Rubin's life. The consequences lasted much longer, but Kathy's life lasts longer still. Last week, Rhonda Stapley showed us what happens when Bundy's mask slips. Kathy's story asks us to look somewhere else entirely, not at Bundy's psychology, charm, or methods, but at the person who remained after he left. Ted Bundy did not create Kathy's strength. He encountered it. Her resilience wasn't a gift. Her lupus wasn't a cosmetic preparation for meeting him, and subsequent hardships weren't tests she had to pass. They were events that happened, and Kathy just kept on living. That's why her story shouldn't end with Bundy leaving her bedroom, or the arrest or conviction or execution. They are endings to his story, but not Kathy's. He doesn't get to own what she did afterward, and he doesn't get to become the title of her life. Bundy spent years lying, manipulating, using aliases, controlling his victims, but he couldn't control what Kathy would eventually say. He couldn't stop her from testifying against him, couldn't stop her from surviving for decades, or refusing to make him the center of her memoir. Truth outlasts the person who tried to destroy it. And sometimes the trail it leaves behind doesn't lead back to the killer. It leads back to the survivors. Kathy Kleiner Rubin survived Ted Bundy, but most importantly, she survived beyond him, reclaiming her story, her voice, and who she was before, during, and after. Ted Bundy left destruction behind. Kathy left testimony, memory, and a light in the dark. Her story and her voice with her name on the cover. The truth always leaves a trail, and sometimes it leads you back to the survivor who lived long enough to tell it. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been another episode of When Killers Get Caught.